Story 1. The sounds of the city at night were comforting to me. I liked the noise of the cats, the shouting of drunk people, and even the occasional gunshot. I felt at home with all the chaos, so I had no problem going for nightly jogs while the city slept. I was faster than the people who sometimes tried to trip me to steal my phone or purse, so I didn't worry much. One night, I finished a long run in the park. I was very tired and sweaty. It was very late, and I started to walk back home. I passed dirty, empty streets, overturned trash cans, and homeless people sleeping on cardboard sheets. There was a bad part of town I had to go through to get to my apartment. I had my taser ready, hidden in the drawstring of my sweatpants. Sometimes the sleeping people on the street would move, and I would quickly cross the street to avoid any danger. I was almost out of the slums when I passed a long, dark alleyway. I heard a sound from deep within the darkness, and I stopped. It was sobbing, a quiet, sad cry that sounded like a young child. I heard the sniffling and whining of what must have been a very young boy. Looking down the alleyway, the darkness looked very thick. I didn't want to go into it. It looked so dark that I might get lost in it. But the cries grew louder. It must have awakened some kind of maternal instinct I never knew I had. I took a deep breath, turned on my taser, and forced myself into the alley. The smell was terrible. It was a mix of burning trash and human waste that hurt my nose as soon as I smelled it. I tried not to gag and breathe through my mouth. After a few steps, I could almost see something huddled in a ball at the end of the alley. The crying was softer now. I heard some muttering with the crying, some words in a child's voice that I couldn't understand. I thought I heard help and mum, but I wasn't sure. I stepped in something squishy under my running shoes, almost falling. I steadied myself and moved forward more carefully. "Hey, kid, are you all right? Where are your parents?" I asked the person against the wall in front of me. I still couldn't see them clearly. Are you gonna hurt me too?" the childish voice asked, full of emotion. They still faced the wall. "No, come on, I can get you some help." I took out my phone to use the flashlight. It was almost dead. I didn't want to waste the battery, but I couldn't see anything in the dark alley. While I fumbled with my phone, the person spoke up. "Thank you, miss. If only the world were filled with more kind people like you," they said happily. "Sure, kid." I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the spot where I heard the voice. The light showed a pale, shirtless man curling his thin body into a ball. When the light hit him, he faced me. The skin on his face sagged. It was loose, like it had been lazily draped over the muscle. It peeled in parts. One eye was missing. The socket was completely empty. He smiled at me with about a dozen extra teeth jutting out of his gums at strange angles. "You'll help me, miss? You'll save me?" he asked, the voice of a young boy coming from the mouth of a grown man. There are two major reactions to danger: fight or flight. I could either attack him and try to be the last one standing, or I could run away and never look back. But unfortunately, I always had the worst reaction. I froze. My phone fell to the ground. The flashlight aimed straight up, casting a scary shadow on the man's face. "I don't have a name, miss. This body had a name, but I can't use it anymore." The man crawled up to me on all fours. He looked up at me, inspecting my body like a piece of meat. "You're beautiful, miss. You'll help me, right? You said you would." He grabbed my ankle, wrapping long, thin fingers around it and squeezing. I hadn't taken a breath in over 30 seconds. At his touch, I gasped for air, regaining some of my senses. The taser was still in my left hand. I turned it on, the arc of electricity making a loud buzz. The man saw the taser turn on, and before I could use it, he grabbed my other ankle and pulled it, making me fall to the ground. I let out a quick yelp before my back hit the cement, sending pain up my spine. "I thought you were going to help me." The man crawled up my body, past my legs, up to my chest, until he pinned me to the ground, his face inches from mine. I could smell his breath. It was worse than the alley's stench. his one eye fixed on me with a pained stare. "Help!" I finally managed to scream. "Help me! Someone help!" I thrashed around, but he had me pinned tight. "It's okay," the man assured me. From that distance, I could see every wrinkle, every blemish on his disfigured face. "Someone, please," I begged. My screams echoed through the alley, but the city was indifferent. He crawled further up my body, pinning my arms with his knees. With his free hands, he grabbed my mouth and forced it open. My screams turned into gargles. I couldn't form words with his hand in my mouth. I felt my stomach turn. The waves of nausea hit me. The stench, the sight of it all made me feel sick. I hated feeling helpless more than anything, and watching that thing crawl from his mouth and near mine made me feel doomed. The black thing dangled out of his mouth and extended a tendril toward mine. I tried to shake my head and clamp down my jaws, but I failed. The tendril touched my tongue. It felt warm and slippery. More of the tendril snaked down into my throat. The black mass plopped into my mouth and crawled its way into my body. My whole body heaved, trying to reject the invader, but I couldn't do anything to keep it out. I felt it wriggle down my throat and into my body. The man on top of me went completely limp. He collapsed over me, smothering me with his weight. I threw him off me and writhed on the ground as the black mass made itself at home inside of me. I could feel it extending to every part of my body, making itself part of my nervous system and weaving into my muscles. After half an hour of my body changing itself around that thing, I stopped feeling it move inside of me. I threw up everything in my stomach. I lay empty on the ground next to the man who had put that thing inside of me. I couldn't do anything but cry or shiver in disgust for a while. I had to get to a hospital or something, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It stirred inside me. "Leave." The voice came from inside me. It sounded perfectly clear, but projected directly into my mind. My head was filled with images, me leaving the scene, walking down the road, and returning home. I clutched my head. Sharing headspace felt confusing. "Get out of me," I shouted into the empty alleyway. "What are you?" I was still standing over the disfigured body of the man from earlier. It seemed like whatever climbed into me was keeping him alive. "Leave," it told me. I felt its emotions. It seemed frustrated and impatient. My vision turned red. How can I get my body back? "Please," I begged. Sunrise would be soon. I needed to get out as soon as possible. "Leave," the thing in my head said. It didn't have a voice. It projected ideas and feelings into me instead of speaking. I could feel it getting angry. I wasn't going to let it order me around that easily. "Answer me," I demanded. As soon as I spoke, I felt my heart seize, my stomach cramp, my lungs collapse, and my liver send waves of pain into my brain. I fell to the floor, hitting my knees and screaming in pain while holding myself. The pain stopped as quickly as it started. "Leave," it ordered me again. The creature was punishing me. It showed me what would happen if I didn't obey. I got up and hurried home, leaving the deformed body to rot in the alley. By the time I got home, my body felt strange. I locked the door behind me and ran to the bathroom in case I needed to throw up. Something was making me sick and weak. There was a hole inside of me. My body was failing. The invader was doing something to me. I looked in the mirror and saw that my body had already started to change. My skin had a yellowish tint, like I had a severe case of jaundice, and heavy bags weighed down my eyes. My arm started to itch. I pulled up my sleeve and found a patch of flesh becoming necrotic. Blackened and cracked skin spread and expanded fast enough that I could see it. Dark veins spread over my forearm, snaking further up my body. I touched the decaying flesh and it came off in small chunks. I pulled my hand back in disgust, knocking over the items on my sink. "What's happening? What are you doing to my body?" I tried to get a response from the thing inside me. I wasn't sure if I could communicate with it. but I was so disgusted by what was happening that I wanted to cut off all the infected parts myself, even though it would do more harm than good. I tried to disinfect it, grabbed some bandages from my drawer and wrapped the decaying flesh. My mouth twitched against my will, and I started speaking in a voice that wasn't mine. "We're already rotting," the creature said with my mouth. Watching something else talk through me in the mirror was surreal. "Your body doesn't like me. Find new parts, or we will die." The tone it used was the same as the man who had attacked me. I fought for control of my mouth and lost. "Find parts, or I will take your body until it decays." The creature gave me my mouth back. It wasn't breathing while it took over, so when I came back, I had to gasp for air. "What do you mean, find parts?" I asked. The creature projected a scene in my mind. I was watching a memory from someone else's perspective. In the memory, they chased down a man in a park, tackling him into the bushes. They struggled for a while. I could see the hands like they were mine as they mounted the man and wrapped around his neck. The man resisted, trying to buck his hips and roll on his back, but the strength of the hands was too much for him. The hands squeezed tighter, choking the man until his eyes lost their light and spittle dripped from his mouth. Once the person whose memories I watched was satisfied, they pulled a jigsaw from their backpack. Experiencing the memories, I could feel the person's emotions. They were desperate and terrified. Their sleeves had come up in the struggle and their flesh was rotting like mine, but it had progressed much further. Chunks of their arm were missing. The veins extended past their shoulder. The jigsaw whirred to life, the serrated blade moving up and down quickly. They took the blade to the man's stomach. After some sloppy cuts and shaky handling, the blade made it through the flesh. They dragged the blade up, splitting the man's torso open from his belly button to his chest. The open cavity steamed as its warmth met the chilly night air. The person threw aside the jigsaw and plunged their hands into the man's body, fishing around deep past his stomach until they took hold of the organ they were looking for and pulled it loose after cutting it with a pocket knife. One perfectly intact liver rested in their blood-soaked hands, still oozing warm liquid. I could feel the person's absolute disgust. Their guilt was so strong that they wished they were dead, but their fear of the rot kept them from giving up. Black tendrils spilled from their mouth, wriggling towards the liver and wrapping around it. The tendrils pulled the liver into the person's body and the memory went dark. I came back to my senses. I could still feel my hands around someone's neck and the sensation of ripping out an organ. I threw up in the toilet and collapsed to my knees, trembling. My arm itched worse than before. I have to take people's organs. The thought of it disgusted me even more than the idea of rotting. "Find parts," it demanded straight to my head. "No, this is crazy," I protested. My heart seized like before, sending me back to the ground, clutching my chest. I groaned and convulsed, but it didn't stop. The creature gave me another heart attack, then another, then a fourth, until I was left foaming at the mouth. My world had become pain. All I felt, all I could think about, was the agony I was in. I would do anything to make it stop. After 10 minutes of consecutive heart attacks, they stopped, and I was left semi-conscious on the ground. Find parts. The creature projected the image of its last host looking in the mirror, his body ravaged by lesions and necrosis. "Please, no more," I begged. "I'll do it. I'm sorry." The creature was silent, satisfied by my cooperation. I stumbled to my room and put on a thick hoodie and pants to hide every bit of skin. There was one saving grace about my situation. I worked as a physician's assistant at a hospital. I might be able to get a hold of donor organs. It was my only real option. I packed my withering body into the car and drove off, hoping to arrive while it was less busy. Donor organs don't stay good for long. The longest an organ can be kept is a kidney, which lasts for 24 to 36 hours. If a kidney happened to be kept on ice, that could slow down the rot, at least for a short time. I arrived at the hospital about 3 hours before my shift. I tried to quietly pass the receptionist, but she saw me. "Veronica, you're early. What's the occasion?" she asked. Her name was Julie, and she had been a long-time colleague. She knew me well and might have noticed something was wrong. Dr. Wilkins asked me to come in early to help prep for an operation he took over from someone else. "I have to go. I'll talk later." I tried to hurry off again. "Wait," Julie called out. Her curiosity was about to get me into trouble. "Are you all right? Your skin looks a bit discolored. Have you had a fever? Stomach pain?" she asked with concern. "I'm fine. I really need to go." I walked off, not looking back as she kept talking. "Okay, just be careful. We don't need you getting sick," she called after me, but I was already turning the corner. I hated the hospital. It was a reminder of my failure. I had settled as a physician assistant, PA. I wanted to be a pediatrician, but I dropped out of med school in my 3rd year. I had to watch other people live out my dream. With the parasite inside me, I had never felt more helpless. I needed to get my priorities straight. There were computer records of upcoming surgeries. If an operation was coming up, they might have an organ ready for transplant. I just had to sneak in and take it. Before I could reach a computer, I ran into the person I was hoping to avoid the most. "Veronica, what are you doing here? You're not scheduled for another 2 hours," Dr. Wilkins said, blocking my way to the computer. I thought about pushing past him. The creature inside me was losing patience again. I could feel it getting more eager and hungry. "Hello, Dr. Wilkins. I'm just doing a favor for Kyle." "He needed help with some documents," I said, avoiding eye contact. Dr. Wilkins didn't seem to notice my skin. He never paid much attention to me. "Look at you, always the go-getter." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You're finally starting to fit in with the family here." "Yeah," I replied. "I need to get going." "Sounds good. See you later," Dr. Wilkins said, walking away with a smile. After that conversation, I felt even more nauseous. Finally, I reached the computer and checked the operation schedule. After some clicking, I found a kidney on ice in storage. The operation was scheduled for 4 hours later. Without a second thought, I headed to storage. The rot was spreading further. Some of the black veins were visible on my hands. The hall to the storage area was empty. I checked for footsteps, and once the coast was clear, opened the door and slipped inside. The chill hit me immediately. Even with my outfit, I couldn't help but shiver. I found the transport box with the organ inside. The creature inside me was excited. Its eagerness was contagious. I wanted to open the box and consume the kidney as soon as possible. Carefully, I opened the box, revealing the slimy, fleshy mass inside. My body vibrated with anticipation. I picked it up with my bare hands, bringing it to my face. Something slithered up my throat. A few slippery tendrils made their way from deep inside me, past my throat, and out of my mouth. The tendrils touched the organ before wrapping around it and lifting it toward my open mouth. It smelled like raw beef, just as I expected. It barely fit in my mouth and felt disgusting on my tongue, like a giant raw oyster. The tendrils pulled the kidney down my throat, gagging me and resting somewhere deep inside my body. I felt immediate relief wash over me. I pulled up my sleeve and unwrapped the bandages. The veins had retreated from my hand, and the area of rot was shrinking as the flesh healed itself. I heard the door open behind me. Before I could react, my co-worker Kyle stepped into the room. He looked from the open organ box to my slimy mouth to the rot on my arm. Kyle froze, and the creature acted first. The black tendrils shot out of my mouth, wrapping around Kyle and pulling him toward me. I saw the panic in his face, his wide eyes and open mouth. I tried to close my mouth and pull back the tendrils, but one of them pushed a mass into Kyle's mouth right as he tried to scream. I could see the bulge in his throat as it moved into his body. Kyle collapsed to the ground, convulsing. The tendrils retreated back inside me. What did you do?" I tried to keep my voice down, but it came out as a scream. The creature didn't answer. Kyle stood up in a trance. "Kyle, are you okay?" I shook him by the shoulders. He walked out the door without looking at me. I peeked out the door. Kyle walked down the hall and into the reception area. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment before clutching his chest and groaning in pain. "Help me," he croaked out before collapsing face first on the floor, completely still and silent. The receptionist called for help, and Kyle was rushed out on a stretcher while I watched in stunned silence, unable to help. Before someone could discover me, I ran out of the storage room, down the hall, and through the emergency exit. I made it to the garage and got into my car, slamming my fists on the steering wheel. What did you make me do? I held my head in my hands, crying in frustration. It was my fault. If I had been more careful, if I had been more decisive, Kyle would be alive. "Answer me," I shouted at the creature. More parts," it replied. I slammed the dashboard and cried for a while. I needed to get the creature out of me, but I didn't know how. It could control my body to some extent, and it could cause me intense pain if I tried to disobey. To get more parts, I would need to steal from more donors, which would be almost impossible after what I had just done, or start taking them from live people. I wasn't going to kill people, even to save myself. I drove back home, ready to barricade myself in my house until I decayed into a pile of flesh and bones. The rot was spreading again. It was slower than before, but the veins were up to my wrist. I took off my hoodie and resisted the urge to scratch the blackened flesh. It started to smell. I couldn't ignore the stench of death coming from the rot. I replaced the bandages and lay on my bed. My body felt more fragile as the minutes passed. More parts, the creature reminded me. I stayed quiet. Then, my vision turned red, and I sensed its growing anger. "Find more," it demanded. There was a sharp pain in my liver, like someone had hit me. I curled up on my bed, clutching my body. "Go away," I hissed through clenched teeth. The creature hit me with another wave of pain, this time in my spine. The pain shot through my body, reaching my fingertips. For the next 2 hours, the creature tortured me with nausea, headaches, dizziness, and anything else it could. I started to lose my resolve. "Leave, leave, leave." The creature kept saying this in my mind over and over. The pain and the commands drove me crazy. I picked up a lamp and threw it across the room. It shattered into many pieces on the floor. "Stop, please," I begged the creature. It only wanted one thing, and I couldn't give it. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked nothing like me. The woman in the mirror was a monster. Her skin was yellowish, and the whites of her eyes were almost completely red. My hair started to fall out. I ran my hand through my hair, and it came out in clumps. I grabbed the sides of the mirror and leaned back to hit my head against the glass. As I moved my head forward, I lost control of my body. It stepped back without my permission. "We're running out of time," the creature said through my mouth in a flat, rough voice. "We will rot." It lifted my arm up. When the creature took control, the decay spread quickly, climbing up to my shoulder. The veins covered my chest, and I could see one of my ribs starting to bulge, pushing my skin out of shape. "Find parts, or you will become something else. Something not human. I will give you more pain than you can imagine." I felt control return to me, and I fell to my knees. I understood more about the decay and the creature, but that only made things worse. I lost feeling in most of my right arm, but I could still move it. The creature I was becoming was a horror. Just looking at myself was miserable. I didn't want to be in more pain, and I didn't want to die. It seemed like I wouldn't even get to die as myself unless I gave in to the creature and found more parts. My body started to burn. Every nerve ending felt like it was on fire. I rolled on the ground, but it didn't help. I couldn't even scream anymore. Leave, leave, leave. The commands kept coming. I couldn't take it anymore. I'll do it, I will, just stop. The pain stopped immediately, and I could crawl to my knees. I wanted to keep resisting. I wanted to be more than a tool for the creature, but in the end, I was too weak. I wrapped every rotting part of my body in bandages and put on heavy clothes covered in perfume to hide the smell of death. I waited a few hours until it was very late, then left my home to do what the creature wanted. Unlike the man in the creature's memories, I didn't have any tools to cut open bodies, so I had to use a large kitchen knife. I stood in the doorway, thinking about turning back. If I used the knife on myself, it would all be over. The creature and I would both die, nobody else would get hurt. I wished I could be selfless like that. I had to fight for everything I had. I thought of myself as a survivor. I wanted to be the kind of person who would help others. But that wasn't me. I was the kind of person who felt relieved when Kyle died in a way that didn't get me in trouble. I gripped the knife, tucked it into my pants, and headed to the park. I thought the best target would be someone homeless. There were a few spots in the park where homeless people often slept. I was lucky not to run into anyone on the way. There was a place with hollowed-out bushes that made good spots to sleep. I moved forward, checking for joggers or passers-by. I was already nervous. The idea of killing someone made me sick, but the itchiness from the rot kept me moving. I made excuses to myself, stupid excuses. I tried to think that at least homeless people wouldn't be missed, as awful as that was. There was one person in the bushes. It was a shorter man in torn, baggy clothes that looked too thin for the cold. He was asleep, breathing slowly. The man didn't hear me as I moved through the bushes and crawled towards him. I was on my knees, just a few feet away. I tried not to look at his face, but I couldn't help it. He looked young, too young to be on the streets. He was pale and thin. I could tell he hadn't eaten in a while. I would kill him. I would end his life because I thought mine was worth more. My hands shook as I raised the knife over his chest. I hovered there for a minute. Parts. Now. The creature's command was loud in my mind. It wanted to take over, but the rot had spread so much that I could fall apart if it did. I felt tears in my eyes. They were selfish tears. I didn't cry because this man would never get a better life, but because I would have to live with the guilt. He was lying on his back. I aimed the knife at his heart and tried to steady my hands for a clean stab. My hands, the hands I trained to save lives, thrust down at the man, aiming for his heart. Before the knife could hit, he turned over in his sleep, and the knife went into his shoulder. "Shit!" I shouted, pulling the knife out. What? The man woke up, staring at me in shock. He saw the knife and moved back. "What are you doing?" he screamed, holding his shoulder to stop the bleeding. I froze. The knife was in my hands, but I looked at him like a deer in headlights. The man saw my hesitation and lunged at me, trying to get the knife. He knocked my weak, dying body to the ground, pinning me down and reaching for the knife. I scratched at his face. I managed to get a finger in his eye, making him scream and loosen his grip. I pushed him away but didn't move him far. He came back, angrier than before. The man grabbed the knife and tried to stab my neck. Before the knife could reach me, the black tendrils shot from my mouth and wrapped around his wrist. He dropped the knife as the tendrils squeezed his wrist, breaking it. I picked up the knife and stabbed his neck. The knife went deep, cutting his carotid artery and sending blood spurting out onto me and the ground. The man put a hand to his neck, gurgling and moaning. He went limp quickly. I knelt over his body, breathing hard from the fight. My heart was racing. I couldn't look at what I had done. I had nothing left to vomit. I had already thrown up 3 times, but I dry heaved over him. "Take part." The creature commanded me. I still had work to do. I pulled off his clothes and exposed his chest. I could see where I needed to cut to open him up. The creature showed me an image of a human heart. I can't. What use was there in complaining? I had come that far. The time to turn back had passed. I took the knife and pushed it into the man's chest, dragging it toward me until his chest was open. The creature gave me memories of past hosts taking out hearts to make it easier for me. I had only finished part of med school before I quit, but some of the experiences stayed with me, making it a bit easier to do the procedure. After some cutting and pulling, the heart came free. Those disgusting tentacles came from my mouth and wrapped around the heart, pulling it into my mouth. The heart was big, so the tentacles had to squeeze the flesh, but it managed to fit down my throat, its slimy surface tickling me the whole way down. Once the heart was in my body, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The veins went away, the same as before, and some of my strength returned. "Not enough," the creature said. "Your body is broken. Find a new host." The command came. What? I could tell that I hadn't healed as much as last time. I remembered the last time the creature left a host. The host's body fell on top of me. "I thought this would be enough," I shouted. The creature showed me another memory. This time I was seeing from the perspective of a man pinning someone else to the ground. The person he pinned to the ground was the man who had attacked me in the alley. The creature climbed out of the man's mouth and into my attackers. The perspective shifted. I was seeing from my attacker's view. I could see the man that the creature left standing before stumbling away. I'll survive. If I passed the creature on, I could live. From what I could gather, the last host was too far gone, but I could still make it. I could pass on this burden that was worse than death to someone else. It was worse than killing them, but I felt such a weight off my shoulders, I didn't care. Maybe the next person would be stronger than me, strong enough to end this somehow. I knew where to go. I went back to the same slums where the last host attacked me. It was the same as last time. Trash filled the streets and the occasional junkie passed out on the sidewalk. There were targets everywhere, and I just needed to find somebody alone. Up ahead, a woman was standing near an alley, slouched over and staring at the ground high on something. "Miss, would you like some help?" I called out to her. As eager as I was to have the creature out of me, the nerves shook my body. That intense itching returned. The heart had barely stopped the rot. The woman grunted in response, unable to meet my eyes. "Come with me, it'll all be okay," I stammered, taking her arm and guiding her into the darkness of the alley. She tripped after we'd made it halfway in, lying on the floor, moaning softly. "I'm sorry." I got on top of her and held her mouth open. "I'm so sorry." The creature, sensing my intention, moved its body up my throat, squirming under my skin. The creature wasn't too happy with the woman I chose, but it didn't have much of a choice. I felt its whole body in my mouth. I could taste it on my tongue, and it was bitter. The creature hung from my mouth. I held the woman's jaws open and let it slide down into her throat. I felt like I'd removed a huge splinter as it left me. My damaged flesh didn't return to normal, nor did my bloodshot eyes or yellowing skin, but I was free. The woman on the ground shook as the creature made itself a part of her body. "Thank you, miss. I hope you'll be better than me." Relief and guilt fought inside me, and neither won. I walked back home with one burden traded for another. The rot ruined my body and my life would never be the same. The next day I packed everything I had into my SUV and drove off in a random direction. I was a murderer, a freak, and a coward. Story 2. My wife has started eating parts of me and I don't know what to do. I'm using this account just to get my thoughts out. My name is Jason and her name is Mariana. We met in late August of 2021. I was smoking outside the building where I worked. 3 days earlier, my mother had died from a heroin overdose. I hadn't slept at all for those 3 days. So, I threw myself into my job at a hardware store. She walked around the corner, past the big propane tank, and looked at me. Our eyes met, and she smiled. Her beautiful black hair flowed down her back. Her dark eyes looked like they were from a painting. In a strange way, she reminded me of my mom. I smiled back and managed to say, "How you doing?" She kept walking. I've wondered how my life would be if that was all it ever was. But it wasn't. She came back to the hardware store the next day. Mariana was looking for a handsaw. She saw me working behind the counter and asked for my help. She had a notepad which was open. She told me exactly what she wanted, a folding pruning saw. I checked her out and even gave her my employee discount. She left the notepad on the counter when paying and walked out without it. I was going to run after her to give it back, but I saw what it said. Written on it were the words, "Call me," along with her number. Later that night, I did. She answered on the third ring. We talked for hours and set up a date for the following Saturday. After that, it was history. We had a wonderful date. During that first date, I learned she was from Venezuela and that she was visiting her uncle. We spent several more nights together, kissed on the fourth date, and she went back to Venezuela the day after our fifth date. We kept in touch and started dating officially a few weeks after she returned to Venezuela. I offered to visit her several times, but she didn't want me to. Everything was fine until I cheated on her. It was just once. I had gotten used to being with multiple partners because of my relationship with my ex-boyfriend. My ex didn't love me. He used me for money and for my unconditional love until he left me for another guy. He wanted an open relationship, so I got used to that. Mariana said she had forgiven me, but I don't think she ever did. She managed to visit the US again, and her visa was extended so she could move here. Her mother didn't want her to leave Venezuela, especially not for someone like me. Her mom said I would never understand their values. I never met or spoke to Mariana's mom. We got married in early 2023 on March 5th. She got her green card in September. At this time, I had switched jobs to working in a professional kitchen as a line cook. Her uncle gave her a job at his company. Soon enough, I was able to switch from working full-time to part-time so I could spend more time with Mariana. We're both young. I'm 33 and she's 31. I started playing the guitar again. One autumn evening, I played it for Mariana. I made a lot of mistakes, but she didn't judge me for it. She understood my nerve damage and always called me pretty. She never judged me for the mistakes I made because of the nerve damage in my arms or the scars that caused it. Back in November, Mariana asked me about Thanksgiving and what the meal plans were. I told her I'd make whatever she wanted. She said all she wanted was me and gently hugged me from behind, then kissed my cheek. A couple of weeks later, around the 14th, she asked me randomly, "Have you ever wanted to eat anyone?" I responded no, then asked if she wanted to. "Yes, I do." "Want to eat me?" I asked sarcastically. "Would you let me?" she asked. "If you asked nicely." We both laughed. The next night she asked me, "Jason, can I eat you, please?" "Sure, grab the carving fork," I joked, but when I looked at her, her face was serious. "Maria," I asked. "Jason, I want to try eating someone and you said you'd let me if I asked nicely." I was confused by her statement. I wanted to make a joke, but I couldn't. My eyes dropped to the floor, then back to her face. I was going to say no, but I couldn't. I'd do anything for her. I needed her more than anything. When I couldn't see her because I was at work or she was at her job, I couldn't feel my face. I wanted to ask her uncle for a job at his company, but she never let me meet him. I didn't care to fight for it. "I'll take a bath and cut off some of the dead skin from my foot for you, okay?" She nodded. I went upstairs and drew myself a bath. I grabbed my safety razor and removed the blade. After soaking in the hot water for a while, I carefully cut off the dead and hard skin from my heel. I didn't do anything too fast or too deep. I took my time, and by the time I was finished, Both of my heels were bare, red, with small slivers of calluses. I kept the pieces of skin outside the tub. I drained the water, dried myself, got dressed, and took the chunks of dried skin to the kitchen. There Maria was waiting just where she had been when I went to take a bath. I went to the stove. I quickly pulled out a non-stick pan and put it on a burner. I poured olive oil into the pan and placed the pieces of dead foot skin in the oil. I didn't turn on the heat yet. I knew the bits were going to be hard, so I wanted them to be hot but not colored, as that would make them too hard. I chopped a yellow onion into fine pieces and got plenty of cilantro leaves. I took some small corn tortillas and microwaved them wrapped in wet paper towels. I then turned the stove on medium heat to start warming up the pan and cooking the bits of dead skin. I knew the Maillard reaction wouldn't happen before they were fully cooked. I cooked the pieces to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, crispy but not colored or charred. I managed to make 4 tacos out of the 5-inch tortillas. I put down a tortilla, added the pieces of skin, the onion, and cilantro on top. I placed the plate of tacos in front of Maria and served it with homemade habanero pineapple hot sauce. I went to clean up, but then I heard her soft, beautiful voice. "Aren't you going to join me? It's our meal after all." My eyes turned to her, but my body didn't want to move. If it were possible, I would have pushed my eyeballs out of their sockets to avoid moving. "Sit down and try it with me, Jason." I swallowed, but my mouth was dry. I tried to turn on my heels, but a burning softness shot up my legs. My whole body turned to face her. My bulging eyes couldn't hide the discomfort I felt. I walked slowly to the chair next to her. She smiled and slid the plate between us. "You first. It's your cooking, dear." I sat up and gave her a weak smile. With coldness rising to my fingertips, I picked up one of the 4 tacos and took a bite. The initial flavors of the soapy cilantro and harsh onions hit my palate, along with the mealy texture of the tortilla. But then I felt something worse. My teeth struggled to bite through the hot flesh. My tongue burned. I tried to chew through the dead, hard, and stringy pieces of my heel skin. I sawed my jaw forward and back to cut up the almost mealworm-textured flesh. I couldn't chew it again, so I swallowed it. The spiky, rough ball of food went down my throat. I wished it would block my windpipe, but it didn't. I lowered the taco and looked at her. "You didn't try it with the hot sauce?" I asked. "Oh no, I couldn't. I wanted to leave more for you." "Don't be silly." She took the spoon from the container and added a big scoop of hot sauce to the remaining half of my taco. "Go ahead," she said, her beautiful eyes looking at me. Dread filled me. It felt like a portal to the abyss had opened next to me. I shoved the food into my mouth but couldn't take another bite. I felt my body start to vomit as I rushed to the kitchen sink and spit the food out onto the dirty dishes. "Oh, can't handle your spice, hun." More for me then. She ate every bite without flinching. I cleaned the kitchen and went to bed. I don't know how long it took for her to join me. When she kissed me goodnight, I nearly threw up again. I couldn't stand her hot breath hitting my nose. I didn't eat again for 3 days. On the 3rd day, when Maria had gone to work, I made myself some ramen. I saw that she had eaten most of the food in the kitchen over the past few days. My anxiety continued, and the house I lived in no longer felt like home. I stared at the spot where she had sat just a few days earlier. The ramen didn't calm my nerves. I had trouble even swallowing the soft noodles and warm broth. The long, gelatinous noodles felt like they were choking me, and the warm broth felt like bile. I tried to keep myself busy. I trimmed my nails, both finger and toe, and put the trimmings in an empty bathroom trash can. After that, I just went to bed. I woke up around 9 p.m. Maria should have been home by then. I went downstairs to the living room, but she wasn't there. I saw her keys on the coffee table and her shoes by the couch. I felt a soft, gentle ping in my ears that echoed into my brain. I turned slowly to the kitchen, expecting to see her eyes staring at me. Nothing. No Maria. No threat. No figure. No abyss. I didn't want to search for her. I went back upstairs to the bedroom feeling like a magnet being pulled. The warm, soft bed was the only thing that gave me any sense of comfort or warmth. I stood in the center of our room and suddenly I needed to use the bathroom. I walked to the toilet to relieve myself, but as I entered the bathroom, there she was. Maria was hunched over the toilet, bending her body over the toilet lid and into the garbage bin. Her index and middle fingers moved in and out, taking each bit of my toe and fingernails into her mouth. Her head turned to me, and her beautiful eyes pierced my soul again. She kept crunching through the keratin from my nails, just looking at me while doing it. I said nothing and went back to our bedroom. I fell flat on the bed and went to sleep. Sleeping was all I did for a while. I quit my job shortly after. Handling raw chicken with tongs and placing it on the grill made me feel awful. I yelled at my manager, threw my time card at him, and left. After that day, all I did was lie around and sleep. I had the occasional meal or snack when Maria wasn't around. We didn't celebrate Thanksgiving. My family wanted to visit and finally meet Mariana, but I didn't want to see them. Maria asked me to make foot tacos only once more. By that time, the skin on my heels had grown back. It wasn't hard and dead, but it was back. It was much more difficult to slice them up that time, but I did it. This was on December 21st. She didn't make me eat any this time. On December 23rd, I went out drinking with a few friends all afternoon and evening. I got a ride home from an Uber. Mariana met me with her usual warm smile, and I felt so happy to see her. My arms locked around her neck, and I kissed her forehead. She asked me questions about my night, but I could barely answer. I was too drunk to form sentences. I went to bed after saying hello to Maria and fell asleep shortly after. I dreamed of wild dinosaurs and Krampus visiting me because I had been a naughty boy. When I woke up, my eyes instantly shot to the left. Maria had tied my left wrist to the bottom of the bed frame along with my neck. If that wasn't enough, a hard gag was shoved deep in my mouth. She was holding the same folding pruning saw she bought when we first met. I couldn't move. Years of sleep paralysis and anxiety taught me to stay still. She pushed down my carving fork about 3 inches from the top of my wrist. She tightened the skin by pulling it towards her and laid the saw blade flat against my arm. The teeth punctured my skin and tugged viciously on the nerve endings in my arm. She knew what she was doing. She wasn't going deep enough to cut into the tissue below the skin, but just above it. Warm blood splattered around, and the teeth on the saw blade lost their grip and slipped out from under my skin several times. Once she got close to the carving fork, she removed the saw from my skin. The blade, which had been perfectly polished and maintained for years, was now covered in blood. As she pulled the carving fork's tip out of my wrist, it felt like she was pulling out my bone marrow. She bit the very tip of my flesh and tore it off from my arm. Her favorite striped sweater was stained, and her once warm eyes looked at my face. They looked like blank orbs with light behind them. Her once beautiful smooth hair was now messy and knotted. The smell of blood was almost as heavy as the air. She took her time with her meal, enjoying it down to the last inch. When she reached the last inch, she stuck her fingers in my mouth and pulled out the gag. Then, with the fork, she skewered my flesh onto the tip and placed it in my mouth. The cold steel and room temperature meat pushed on my tongue, like I was being treated for iron deficiency. My teeth hooked onto the fork and she slid it out of my mouth. The flesh in my mouth felt like live octopus. I spit it out at her feet. "What are you, crazy? Why would you do this? No more, Mariana, you're hurting me. Stop, stop. God damn it, Jason, I don't want to hear that. You abandoned me practically on Christmas Eve, going God knows where, doing God knows what. How do you think I'm supposed to feel? You cheated on me. You betrayed me. You hurt me." Mariana paused. "And you spit out the food I prepared for you. Why would you do this to me? How could you?" She cut off the zip tie on my wrist and sawed off the rope around my neck. I felt like a puppy that had misbehaved and was punished. My nose had been shoved in my mess. Maria took a pillow and blanket from our bed and went downstairs. I didn't dare follow. I cleaned my wound. She had bought a bottle of rubbing alcohol that was on the bathroom counter. I wiped off the sore and placed the carving fork on our nightstand. I slept in my own blood that night, curled up in the fetal position. When I woke up, Maria was already at work. I felt cold, thirsty, and alone. I properly dressed and treated my wounded arm. I cleaned the folding mechanism of the saw and sharpened my carving fork. I cleaned our duvet, flipped our mattress, and bleached the floor. I then sat all day in the kitchen, like the puppy I was, waiting for my owner who I had disappointed. When she came home, I couldn't look at her. I sat by her, followed her, did what she wanted, but didn't look at or touch her. I didn't see my dad for Christmas. I didn't visit my mum's grave. I didn't drink or launch fireworks on New Year's. I've just been trying to make Maria happy as best as I could. We hadn't kissed since Christmas Eve until earlier this morning. When I woke up, she had made me breakfast in bed. Eggs, sausages, and nice crispy bacon. For the first time since November, I ate a meal I enjoyed. She had been learning how to cook since she felt bad that I was doing all the work in the kitchen. Her arms wrapped around me and our bed felt comfortable again. As I finished the last bit of my breakfast, she kissed me on the cheek. My eyes closed in contentment. When I smiled, her teeth sank deep into my cheek. I quickly turned around and punched her as hard as I could in the face. My cheek was now ripped off and in her mouth. Her tear-filled eyes looked up at me, and she held the side of her face. Maria moved closer to me. The piece of my flesh now dropped out of her mouth. She stopped right in front of me. "I just want your heart." She wept, placing her hand on my chest. "I want you to love me like how you used to." My eyes too became filled with tears. I let myself fall around her. I held her tighter than I ever had before. "I'm sorry. I've never stopped loving you." She looked at me, and I her. It was like our first time kissing again. When our lips locked, I felt a wave of relief that I hadn't felt since the night this started before Thanksgiving. I asked for some time to myself. She agreed and went downstairs and left me in our room. This brings me to writing this. She hasn't forgiven me for cheating on her, and I haven't forgiven myself, my wife. I hurt my wife in a way I never wanted to. I have failed as man and as a person. I don't want to see anyone else anymore, not my family, nor my friends, and certainly not hers. I just want to see her, to be around her. I do not want to die, but I know she'll be the death of me. I want her to get help, and not to go too far with this. Yet Mariana, my wife claims she wants my heart, but she's never given me hers. I can't lose her. She won't lose me, but I don't know how to assure that. Only a few ideas are creeping through my mind and holding my soul hostage. My wife has started eating me alive, and I don't know what to do. Story 3. So I had come home sometime in the fall of 2000 and noticed my mother was visibly upset. She did not outwardly show her distress. Instead, she stared at nothing in particular, completely still. But her eyes showed that something very disturbing had clouded her mind and shaken her to her core. I walked up to her and asked what was wrong, fearing that something bad might have happened to my dad or one of my brothers. She finally looked at me and said, "Steve." Her voice shook. It took me a few seconds to remember the name, and I was relieved it was not my dad or brothers. I then asked her what had happened. She took a moment and said, "Something terrible." Before we go any further, I need to take you back to June of 1999 because that was when I met Steve. Unlike some kids at my high school, I had no summer job, so my mornings were free. But to my annoyance, I was assigned to drive my mother to work bright and early one day. She made me feel better by explaining that I only had to drop her off at her friend May's house a few blocks away. From there, Steve would drive them to work since he works nearby. As a 16-year-old at the time, I was selfishly delighted because that meant I could crawl back into bed. On our way to May's house, my mother told me about Steve. He was the eldest of 4 children. His parents had 2 daughters after he was born, and then another son. Both of his parents worked long hours at low-paying jobs. Steve was happy to help out the family by contributing what he made from his job at a local garage. On top of that, Steve took excellent care of his siblings by acting like a parent. He cooked, cleaned, and drove his siblings to school to make sure they got there safely. He even made time for his longtime girlfriend. My mother also mentioned how popular he was among his many friends. "He is the perfect son," my mother concluded. I rolled my eyes, thinking this was one of my mother's ways of trying to make me act more responsibly as I got older. We reached May's house after a short drive. As we approached, I could see May, Steve, and Steve's girlfriend waiting for us by Steve's car. A big smile appeared on my mother's face when she saw Steve, which only annoyed me more. "Come meet him," she said with a big grin. I got out of my car intending to dislike Steve, but surprisingly all that changed when he introduced himself with a warm handshake and a big friendly smile. He congratulated me on completing the 10th grade. I looked up at him as he spoke and guessed he was in his late 20s or early 30s. He was tall, good-looking, and well-built from his years of work in the garage. I could tell he was someone who could take care of himself physically. I also noticed the affection he and his girlfriend had for each other. He had one arm tenderly wrapped around her waist, and she looked at him with adoring eyes as he spoke. As I drove away, thinking about my warm bed waiting for me, I couldn't help but admire Steve for a moment. He had the looks, the girl, and the car. In the eyes of a teenage boy, it seemed he had everything. Tragically, that all changed beginning with one strange day, a few months after my first and only meeting with him. One morning in the fall of 1999, I was in the kitchen enjoying my breakfast. I could hear my mother's voice in the other room talking on the phone. I heard her mention Steve's name. For a second, I was taken back to the time when we had met. I heard my mother hang up the phone, and shortly after she came into the kitchen. She looked slightly off, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Curious, after hearing Steve's name, I asked her how Steve was doing. He's not well," she replied. "How so?" I asked, confused. She carefully pulled out a chair beside me and sat down. Then she told me what she had heard from May. The previous evening, Steve did not come home for dinner. This was odd because he was supposed to make dinner for his siblings. Worried about his absence, his brother called him on his cell phone, but got his voicemail each time. By the time both of his parents had returned home from work, Steve was still missing. The family waited for hours, getting extremely anxious and worried that something terrible had happened to Steve. Then finally, the back door swung open, and there he was. The family felt a big sense of relief, but that quickly disappeared when they saw that he was drenched from head to toe. It had been a clear day and night without any rain, yet here was Steve, completely soaked. He slowly stumbled into the kitchen, puddles forming at his feet. His father, Ralph, reached out and gripped him by the shoulders, asking what had happened and why he was soaking wet. Ralph's voice was strong, almost demanding his son to tell him who had done this so he could do something about it. And it was Steve's answer that left the family puzzled and scared. Steve revealed that for the past few days he had been seeing a woman wherever he went. He saw her at work, on the streets as he drove by, at his girlfriend's place, everywhere. He described her as being of average height, dressed in a flowing white robe that contrasted with her long, straight black hair, which was parted in the middle. Behind the hair was a face that haunted him. She was extremely ugly, he said. She had dark eyes the size of small pills, giving her a sinister squint. No matter which way Steve moved, he couldn't escape her horrid stare. Her nose was pushed back with barely any cartilage to support it. It looked like a skull's nose. Her face was long and thin, wrapped in stretched-out, pale white skin. There was so little flesh on her face that it seemed her jagged cheekbones would pierce through her skin with the slightest movement. But what terrified him most was her long, gaping mouth. It was twisted in a way that it looked like a half-sobbing cry and half a grotesque grin. This woman, Steve said, appeared at his workplace and told him that she was madly in love with him and that they had to be together forever. Every fiber in his body told him to run, but for some reason he couldn't. Even though he was terrified of her, Steve said he was completely under her spell. So he left his workplace and followed her on foot. With every step, he wanted to turn back and run, but he couldn't fight the force she had over him. She led the way, and they walked a long distance until they reached a remote lake. Once there, a force threw him into the shallow water and held his head underwater. Steve's limbs flailed in every direction as he struggled. He wailed under the water, and just as he was about to drown, he somehow broke free from the force. He got up from the water and looked around. The woman was gone. Steve spent the next few hours walking home from the isolated lake. My mum's fear and sadness were thick in the air as she told the story. "I can't believe it," she muttered. "Me too," I said. Growing up, my brothers and I were both fascinated and terrified by the supernatural. We believed in spirits and the like. So hearing this story confirmed my feeling that evil spirits are real. He has to get some help. "Steve looked so mentally healthy to me," she said, cutting me off. "Wait, what?" I replied. "He always looked fine to me and never acted in a way that made me think he had a mental condition," she said. I was incredulous. "You think there's something wrong with him mentally?" my mother said. "Well, what else can it be? Steve's parents certainly think so." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could the guy I met just months earlier, the same guy who took care of his entire family and had everything together, suddenly be deemed mentally unfit? But that was the conclusion. It was all chalked up to Steve having a mental episode. But it didn't feel right to me. A few months passed without any news about Steve from my mother. My brothers and I asked her about him during that time, but she refused to ask May about his well-being. My mother didn't want to bring up that scary night because May had moved on from it. Also, Steve was a son that May was so proud of. She loved to talk about him, and her admiration for him was clear. Now it was hard for her to talk about him the same way because of his supposed mental episode. Eventually, we stopped asking my mother altogether. Then, one day in the winter of 1999, as if the months of normality were too long, May and her family were revisited by their nightmare. It began when May received a call from the police telling her to come to the hospital. "Your son was in an accident," the voice said. It didn't provide any more information. Thinking her son was in a bad car accident, May and her youngest son, William, rushed to the hospital. As one could imagine, she was a wreck when she arrived. Her heart was racing, fearing she would not see her son alive again. Once there, William found a nurse who directed them to an emergency room doctor. The doctor guided May to a chair before he began. "Your son," he said softly and slowly, "had a really bad fall." "Fall? What do you mean? What happened?" May asked frantically. The doctor explained that a passerby had found Steve's limp body at a construction site for a condo building. It was an off day for the workers, so no one was there. The police believed Steve had fallen multiple stories before landing on the hard, frozen dirt ground. Steve was alive but unconscious when the passerby found him. He had multiple broken bones among his many serious injuries. It wasn't immediately clear what had happened or why Steve was at the construction site. With his range of injuries, including a broken jaw that needed extensive wiring, it would stay that way for days. My mother fought back tears as she described her visit to the hospital to see Steve. The sight of him struck her deeply. He had been a good-looking, fit young man in the prime of his life. Now he lay in a hospital bed, literally a broken version of his former self. In addition to his broken jaw, he had breaks in his nose, collarbone, arm, and leg. His injuries were so severe that the doctors didn't believe he would fully recover. They thought he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life and not regain full strength and mobility in his arm and upper body. I remembered how much my mother had adored Steve, so I could only imagine what May and her family were going through. Several days passed before my brothers and I asked our mother about the incident. I could tell by her face that she knew we would ask sooner or later. I had a feeling she knew days earlier, but was keeping it from us. This confirmed my belief that it had something to do with the woman Steve described. Then, one day, she finally told us. According to May, Steve had been doing well in the weeks after the near-drowning incident. He settled back into his regular routine and acted as if nothing had happened. But as soon as talk of the woman disappeared, it came back stronger. Steve kept talking about the woman to his family. He said he could see her from afar, with her eyes locked on him. No matter where he went, he couldn't escape her presence. "She won't leave me alone," he would say. But for some reason, whether it was not believing their son's claims, having too much pride to admit their perfect son wasn't perfect, fearing the stigma of having a mentally ill child, or Steve's own stubbornness, May and Ralph didn't get any help for Steve. On the day of the fall, the woman approached Steve again and told him she loved him and that they had to be together forever. Just like before, even though he wanted to run away, his body wouldn't let him. He followed her like a puppet, unable to resist. She led him to a condo building that was still under construction. They went up the floors, and at every floor she turned her head back at him and gave him that hideous grin. All Steve could see was the blackness of her mouth leading into the dark abyss of her throat. They reached the highest level that had been built, which was very high off the ground. Unfortunately, the workers had the day off, so no one was there to help. The woman led him to the edge of the building, overlooking the city. She moved close to him, inches from his face, and looked him in the eyes. Her beady eyes were filled with pure sadistic joy. Steve's entire body stiffened with fear. Then he felt a powerful force hit him from behind, like being struck by an invisible wrecking ball. The last thing he remembered was falling straight down the building. My mother's fear was clear as she told this to my brothers and me. She was shaking slightly and tried to hide it. To our shock, my mother then said, "What if he really is being haunted by a spirit?" The hairs on my arms and neck stood up even more. The fact that my mother finally acknowledged the possibility of an evil spirit behind Steve's torment frightened me. All this time she had firmly believed that Steve was mentally ill. She was the counterweight to my brothers and my belief that an evil spirit was the cause of all this. Now she was starting to see things our way, and it was unnerving. After the fall, Steve adjusted to life with physical handicaps as best as he could, which wasn't very good at all. He needed a crutch to walk, and even with it, he had a noticeable limp. The loss of strength in his arm meant he couldn't go back to work. I could only imagine how hard it was for him to accept. He was a man who had achieved so much and was capable of so much. His family had depended on him greatly. Now he depended on them. May told my mother about a time when she went out to eat with Steve and his girlfriend. Steve struggled a lot with feeding himself, but he insisted on doing it without help. He used his better arm and hand to scoop up his food. But his mouth was a problem. His jaw had been so badly damaged that after the wiring was removed, he couldn't open his mouth fully to eat. Food smeared all over his face as he tried to get it into his mouth. Feeling sorry for him, Steve's girlfriend took over and helped guide the food into his mouth. Then chewing became a problem because his jaws didn't line up straight anymore. His teeth came together crooked, making it hard to chew the food. This made it even harder for him to swallow. The other diners in the restaurant stared at Steve as he ate. They didn't realize how disrespectful they were being, but Steve knew why they were staring. He felt anger, humiliation, sadness, and fear. He dropped his utensils, wiped his mouth, and stopped eating. He stared down at nothing for the rest of their time in the restaurant. May feared that he would soon break under the weight of the indignity he faced every day. May's fear came true as the something terrible my mother mentioned at the beginning of the story happened on one tragic day in the fall of 2000. It was late in the afternoon, and the house was silent, as everyone but William and Steve were out. William sat quietly in his room, doing his homework. He liked the silence because it was hard to focus on schoolwork with 5 other people in the house. The silence was shattered by a loud bang that William later described as a door slamming. When he heard the sound, his first thought was to check on his brother. He ran from his room and rushed down the stairs to the basement where he knew Steve was. But Steve was nowhere to be found. He was never seen or heard from again. Steve's popularity, which my mother had talked about, was clear during his vigil or memorial, a gathering of people to remember him and keep hope alive that he would return. A large group of young people joined Steve's family. Many in the group mourned. My mother was one of many who couldn't contain herself and added to the wailing cries that filled the somber gathering. The sadness felt that day matched the shock of a young man in his prime disappearing. I know some readers might be confused by my story. To them, it might sound like a man struggling with mental problems and ultimately losing his mind. But to those readers, I offer a strange episode that happened shortly before Steve began seeing the woman who haunted him. Steve had taken a trip to Thailand with a couple of his friends. One day, Steve suggested they visit a Buddhist temple. His friends thought it was odd because none of them were Buddhist or religious, but they agreed because they wanted to experience the culture. Shortly after they entered the temple, Steve's behavior changed. He seemed completely fascinated by the place. He became very quiet and serious. He walked around as if he knew the place and started praying like a monk. This was very strange for a Westerner who had no previous exposure to Buddhist teachings. Things only got stranger after he returned home. He began talking to his family and close friends about praying with him. He often talked about how peaceful he felt while praying in the temple. May and Ralph felt very uncomfortable because they were not religious and didn't raise their kids to be religious. This obsessive behavior of Steve's for his newfound passion was soon replaced by the appearance of the woman. To this day, many people believe that Steve succumbed to his mental problems. They think his mind went off the rails. But I ask, what if? What if Steve was right the whole time? What if there really was an evil spirit that wanted his soul? What if the woman was standing right in front of him, knowing she would soon have him as he stepped out of his house against his will? Because as soon as people can ask themselves what if, they can begin to acknowledge that maybe Steve's dread and suffering were not just about the woman herself, but the fact that she was real and no one believed him.